The palace is awake long before dawn. In the corridors of Constantinople, oil lamps throw a weak, trembling light across mosaics that once promised an unbroken, heaven-approved order. Now the air carries the smell of sweat and damp wool cloaks, and the low, urgent sound of men speaking too close to one another. Somewhere behind the bronze doors of the imperial apartments, an empress waits for footsteps that will either confirm her power or end her life. Outside, the city presses in on itself. The hippodrome, that old engine of riot and acclaim, sits like a loaded weapon. The Senate gathers in tight knots, feeling the ground shift beneath long-held privileges, and in the barracks and along the sea walls, soldiers listen more carefully than they speak. An empire that has survived Persians, plague, and fire now teeters on something less predictable, a succession. Heraclius, the savior emperor who dragged the true cross back from Persia and then watched new armies surge out of Arabia, has left behind not certainty, but a family trap. His death does not close a chapter, it loosens a knot. Officially, the throne is to pass smoothly through his sons, then to the next generation. Conventional order, spelled out in ceremony and law, says the empire's survival depends on continuity. Purple-born heirs crowned in the right churches, endorsed by the right men. But continuity is a performance, and everyone in the palace knows it. The most dangerous moments are the ones that look orderly. The Empress Martina, Heraclius's widow and niece, a marriage already whispered about in the city, moves through that performance like a professional. She has a son, Heraclonas, crowned and legitimate on paper. She has proximity to the treasury, the palace staff, the mechanisms of proclamation. And she has something else, sharper than legitimacy, urgency. The empire is bleeding territory. The Arab armies raid deeper each year. The old military elites, exhausted and suspicious, have begun to look at Constantinople not as the heart of defense, but as a parasite. Martina does not merely want power. She needs it to be safe. Yet another child stands in the shadows of this dynastic drama. Constans Constantine, to use the name that can be spoken in ceremonies without inviting revolt. He is young, easily overlooked, not the obvious axis of the court. He is exactly the kind of figure an empire chooses when it is tired of ambitious adults. The first instability is simple. No one trusts Martina's regency, and Martina knows it. The Senate's unease hardens into something like moral panic. Martina is a woman ruling openly, and not just a woman, but one whose marriage has always carried the scent of taboo. Chroniclers will later frame this as outrage at incest and foreign influence, as if the empire is defending purity. The more practical fear is cruder. A regency means access. A regency means appointments, confiscations, revenge, and the long memory of who opposed whom in the last crisis. In Constantinople, the past is never dead. It is filed and ready for use. The army, what remains of the old field forces, does not want philosophy or dynastic theology. It wants pay, coherent command, and a government that will not collapse mid-campaign. Officers begin to ask a question that is treasonous only until it becomes common. If the palace cannot produce stability, should the palace be corrected? Martina responds the way many rulers respond when they feel authority thinning. She tightens her grip. She attempts to consolidate the succession, to place Heraclonas beyond challenge. The sources do not agree on every maneuver, who was bribed, who was threatened, who merely read the wind and moved first, but they agree on the atmosphere. The court becomes a pressure cooker of rumor. Every word is overheard. Every dinner invitation is evaluated as a trap. The empire's governing class begins to behave like people living inside a siege, not by enemies at the walls, but by the possibility of sudden arrest. Then the whispers acquire a spine. Valentine, an Armenian officer with troops behind him and no patience for palace choreography, becomes a name spoken with new weight. The Senate, the patriarch, and military factions begin to align, not out of affection, but out of converging fears. The goal is not ideological reform, it is surgical. Remove Martina, reduce Heraclonas, install a figure who can be presented as innocent, legitimate, and controllable. In a city built on ceremony, the coup arrives as an anti-ceremony, a stripping away. Arrests unfold with an efficiency that suggests planning, not spontaneous outrage. Martina is seized. Heracleonas is forced to abdicate. The imperial family that had tried to become the empire's anchor is now treated like contraband. And then comes the most chilling moment, the one designed to outlast the coup itself. Martina's tongue is cut out. Heracleonas' nose is slit. Mutilation is not random cruelty. It is a legal argument made in blood. A disfigured body is a disqualified body, an attempt to prevent future factions from resurrecting a claimant. The court's violence is meant to be permanent, etched into flesh so that the empire will remember the cost of challenging the new order. The child Constans is elevated over the silence that follows. It is not merely a coronation, it is a transfer of everyone's panic into one small body. He is crowned in a city that has just proved it can break an empress and a reigning emperor within days. The throne he receives is still warm from the bodies removed from it. Whatever innocence he might have carried into the palace is not merely endangered, it is irrelevant. The empire's political class has chosen him precisely because he is a vessel young enough to symbolize renewal, royal enough to satisfy legitimacy, malleable enough to be directed. Yet vessels can harden, and children who grow up surrounded by knives learn to keep their hands near the hilt. The first years of Constance's reign are not the story of a boy ruling. They are the story of adults fighting through him. Regents and generals compete to become the true voice behind the imperial decrees. The patriarchate watches, measuring how much leverage a child emperor provides. Senators breathe easier at the removal of Martina, but discover that the coup has not restored a stable constitution. It has taught everyone that force works. Then the empire's external enemies press in, transforming internal tension into existential stakes. By the 640s and 650s, the Arab conquests are not a distant catastrophe. They are an approaching weather system that never ends. Provinces that once financed the empire, Syria, Egypt, are gone or contested. The sea lanes that fed Constantinople are threatened. Raiding fleets appear like sudden dark lines on the horizon, and the empire's old certainty that Roman power belongs naturally on every shore begins to sound like nostalgia. Constans inherits a crisis, not of one war, but of a new strategic reality. A smaller empire forced to defend itself as if it were still vast. He does not respond as a passive symbol. He grows into a ruler obsessed with control of doctrine, of generals, of the provinces that remain. His reign becomes a chain of decisions that attempt to harden the empire's spine, each one creating new enemies. The first decision point is theological. But theology in Byzantium is never only about God. It is about obedience. The empire has been torn for decades by Christological controversy. What exactly to say about Christ's will, his nature, his humanity, and divinity? These debates are not academic. They determine which bishops will support imperial policy, which provinces will accept Constantinople's authority, which communities will see the emperor as protector or heretic. Under Heraclius, compromise formulas had been promoted in hopes of reconciling divided populations. Under Constans, the compromise itself becomes the problem. Constans issues the typos, an imperial order attempting to silence the argument. No more public disputation about one will or two wills. It is a ruler's instinct, born from the memory of a palace coup. Stop the talking, stop the faction making, stop the ideological recruitment, but silence is not neutral. To many in the church, especially in the Latin West, it is an act of tyranny. If the emperor can command silence in doctrine, what cannot he command? The conflict escalates beyond parchment. Pope Martin I refuses to submit. Maximus, the confessor, a scholar monk whose writings and stubbornness make him impossible to ignore, becomes a symbol of resistance. Constans answers with arrest, trial, humiliation. Martin is dragged from Rome, brought east, and condemned. Maximus is mutilated, tongue and hand, the tools of speech and writing destroyed. To some historians, this is simply imperial overreach, a clumsy attempt to control religion that backfires. To others, it is a coherent strategy by a ruler who sees any independent authority, papal, monastic, senatorial, as the seed of the next coup. The dilemma is real. Was Constans defending the empire from fragmentation or defending himself from accountability? The sources, written by churchmen and court chroniclers with their own wounds, do not let the question rest. While the empire fights itself over the nature of Christ's will, it faces a more tangible test on the sea. In 655, the fleet meets the Arabs in what later tradition remembers as the Battle of the Masts. The name itself suggests the scale, not a skirmish, but a forest of rigging and timber, a floating city of war. The Romans, Byzantines, are defeated. Constans is said to have escaped by switching clothes with another man, an exchange of identity as old as monarchy and as humiliating as it is effective. Whether every detail is true matters less than what the story reveals. An emperor forced into anonymity to survive his own battlefield. Defeat at sea is not merely military, it is psychological. It tells the provinces and the generals that the emperor is not protected by fate. It tells the Arabs that the empire's vaunted naval power can be broken. And it tells Constans with brutal clarity that Constantinople's safety is no longer guaranteed by walls and tradition. The empire must change shape or be carved apart. He begins to move. The next reversal is geographic. Constans turns his attention westward, away from the Eastern Front that has consumed emperors for a generation. Italy, Sicily, the central Mediterranean, these are not merely remnants of Justinian's old reconquests. They are the hinge between grain, fleets, and imperial prestige. If the eastern provinces are shrinking beyond immediate recovery, then the West becomes the strategic reserve. It is also, not coincidentally, farther from the factions of Constantinople that taught a child emperor what happens to rulers who are too accessible. Constans arrives in Italy with the weight of an emperor who needs to be seen. In Rome, he is received with ceremony that strains to cover mutual suspicion. The city is Christian, ancient, and proud, and it remembers too well that its pope has been seized under Constance's authority. The emperor prays, donates, performs reverence. Then he removes bronze from buildings metal for war, the sources say, and leaves behind a bitter taste, the empire taking from the city it claims to honor. The move to Syracuse in Sicily is more than a residence change. It is a statement that the center can shift, that Constantinople is not the only throne room. It is also a confession. The emperor who grew up in a palace coup chooses distance as armor, but distance creates its own enemies. In Sicily, Constans attempts to tighten taxation and conscription, extracting resources for a war machine that must now defend coasts as much as borders. Local elites resent imperial intrusion. The army, always hungry and often unpaid, grows restless. The court that follows him becomes a smaller, sharper version of the Constantinopolitan pressure cooker. Fewer walls, fewer witnesses, the same stakes. And then in 668, the end comes not on a battlefield, but in a bathhouse, steam, tile, and the intimate vulnerability of a ruler without armor. Constans is assassinated, struck down by a member of his own household. The sources disagree on the exact conspirators and motives, but they agree on the essential truth. The emperor is killed by proximity. The man who fled Constantinople's factions cannot flee the basic reality of power. Those closest to it are the ones who can end it. A usurper is proclaimed in the wake of the murder, as if the empire has learned nothing. Yet the very speed of the response shows another truth. The imperial system, for all its brutality, has become practiced at sealing ruptures before they spread. Constance's son, Constantine IV, will ultimately secure the succession. The empire will endure, battered and transformed, surviving sieges and theological councils, adapting its military and administration into new forms. But the legacy of Constans II is not a neat arc from child to martyr to villain. It is a set of pressures made visible. His reign reveals an empire no longer sustained by inherited magnitude but by improvisation under siege. The coup that elevated him established a precedent that legitimacy could be corrected by force and then sanctified by ritual. The mutilations of Martina and Heracleonis hang over the period like a quiet doctrine. Power must be made physically irreversible. Constance's own use of coercion, against popes, monks, and dissenting voices, shows a ruler shaped by the fear that words can mobilize men faster than armies. His westward move exposes the geography of survival, the empire bending toward the Mediterranean as its eastern horizons contract. Even his epithet, the bearded, carries uncertainty. Some traditions attach it to him, others to his son. The confusion is fitting. This is an age when names slide between generations, when chroniclers write with factional memory, when the emperor's face is less stable than the office he occupies. What remains clear is the chain reaction. A child, raised on the lessons of a palace coup, grows into a man who tries to silence division, centralize control, and reposition the empire, only to be killed by the same intimate politics that first crowned him. In the long view, Constans II stands at the threshold of a different Byzantium, smaller, harder, more suspicious, less universal in its claims, yet more ingenious in survival. The Rome of marble and broad frontiers has already begun to recede. In its place, an empire learns to live with loss, to govern through shocks, and to treat the throne not as a seat of destiny, but as the most contested. Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch the similar video.